This video is of a PowerPoint. It's about Christian monasticism and is linked to chapters 9 and 10 of the Murillo book for History 113. You may recall that Murillo puts forth the thesis that there are four worlds: the world of the Central Asian steppe that produces a large number of invaders. The second world is the world of China, of India, of the Middle East, and of the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. And the world number three is the hangers-on, so to speak, those worlds that are attached and yet more primitive and more less advanced than the large empires. And then the fourth world would be the world way out at the margins of the trade routes. Murillo again puts forth the thesis that the network of trade and communication is critical to the entire history of the world, and that ultimately, as this time period progresses, the world of networking and communication and trade and commerce will start to trump the importance of the king, the pharaoh, the government, the hierarchy that people found themselves in. In the world of Byzantium, which is the large empire that is the eastern half of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of wealth that had developed over many thousands of years. And when Constantine converted in 312, the Roman Empire started to shift its focus and its power center from the old city of Rome in what is today Italy to the new city of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, that Constantine built in the latter part of his reign from 325 to 337, a 12-year period of time. And ultimately, by the end of his life, Constantine had transferred the reins of government, the levers of power, over to New Rome, Constantinople, which is at the very edge of Europe, looking across over to Asia Minor, what is today Turkey, and guards the Bosporus, which is the entrance to the Black Sea. On the western side of the Roman Empire, that would be the world number three that he talks about, was the barbarian world of people who had invaded from the Central Asian steppe and overrun the western side of the empire. The last emperor sat on that throne in 476 AD, and after that, the entity we would know as Rome continues on in Constantinople, and ultimately it becomes the Eastern Empire of Rome, the Christianized Eastern Empire of Rome, and then also finally the world of Byzantium. And that world spoke Latin in government and Greek in church. The Greek Orthodox Church was the leading Eastern Orthodox Church. There were differences between the two sides. On the Eastern side, the Orthodox churches were divided by ethnicity and language. So you had a series of ethnic churches that developed really over a 1,000-year period. Originally, you had the Greek Orthodox Church, and it took pride in the fact that the New Testament was written in Greek. But there was also the Syriac Church based in Antioch, and they spoke primarily Aramaic, or a descendant of Aramaic. Down in Egypt was the Coptic Church. They spoke Coptic, and they were based in Alexandria. And then further on down in Ethiopia, you had the Ethiopian Church, the Ethiopiac, using the Ethiopiac language. Ultimately, the Greek Orthodox Church sent out missionaries to the north, up to the Rus people, and thus you have the Russian Orthodox Church, which is really only 1,000 years old, but is the largest of the Eastern Orthodox churches in terms of numbers today. The Romanian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So there's a series of churches gathered around language and ethnicity. On the western side, it was different. The Church of Rome and the Latin language was dominant. And there were some other languages as well that were combinations of Arabic and barbarian language. Mozarabic would be one of them. However, ultimately, the Latin language triumphed on the Western side. The Bishop of Rome maintained that he had authority that had been handed down from the previous bishop, who had received it all the way back from a hand-me-down from Peter, who was singled out by Jesus as having special authority. In Matthew, the book of Matthew, Jesus asked people who people say that he is, and they say, well, some say you're John the Baptist raised from the dead, some say you're Elijah, and then it is Peter who says, but you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I say unto you that thou art Peter, Petros, that's the masculine form, and on this Petra, feminine, rock, I will build my church. And the Roman church to this day interprets that rock as being the Bishop of Rome, or at least being Peter. Peter has special authority over the other apostles, and that authority migrated with Peter when, it seems by church tradition, although not according to scripture, he went to Rome and became a leader, an episcopos, a bishop of the Church of Rome, and ultimately was martyred around 64 AD in the Neronian persecutions. The Roman Church also maintains to this day that that Petrine authority did not die with Peter and is not buried with him in the grave, but it was passed on to the next Bishop of Rome, and then on down to the current Pope in the year, this is the year 2019. And so the Roman Catholic Church emerges on the medieval side. In both cases, a lot of money comes flooding into the church, and an awful lot of people who have no idea what it means to be a Christian. And this begins in the year 312. Constantine ordered many of his troops to be baptized. Again, these were mass baptisms. And all of a sudden, soldiers found themselves being marched down to a riverside. They were baptized. They became Christian. And Constantine himself was not baptized until his deathbed in 337. And so we have mass conversions. But as those mass conversions happen, the Church of Jesus Christ has a whole new agenda on its plate, and that is that it needs to teach all of these new folks coming in what it means to be a Christian, how to conduct oneself as a Christian, and you begin to start seeing in the catechisms and in the how should we say, the equivalent of what we might call church membership manuals and so forth, an emphasis on the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. That these are basic things that if you're going to call yourself a Christian, you should at least have in your heart and have in your mind. And so many people came into the church, but the church spends really the next 1,000 years working on this project of teaching the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, first of all of pagan Romans, and then of barbarians who have invaded the Western Empire, the basics of Christian doctrine and Christian conduct. As those who had suffered through the persecutions in the Roman Empire looked around, especially in the first generation, they really objected to some of the things that were happening and going on in this situation. They were really distressed at the corruption that seemed to come into the church, the money, the gold, the silver, and so many retreated, and they retreated into the wilderness, so to speak, as they wanted to go and serve God without the distractions of the troubles and the wealth and the opulence of this world. And so the earliest forms of monasticism in the Christian world, at any rate, were what we would call hermit monasticism or eremitic monasticism. You can see here a picture of a monk climbing up into a cave, and he is living in that cave. That is his place of abode. And in that cave, he would have a Bible. He would pray constantly. At least that's what he aspired to do. And he isolated himself from the temptations of this world and from the riches of this world. Now, this kind of monasticism was championed by a man named St. Anthony of Egypt. And a lot of people end up in these caves. Not all of them were virtuous. Not all of them were consistent in their professions of wanting to follow the Christian ethic and to learn Christian doctrine. At times, irregularities emerged. At times, immorality and problems emerged, and so people started to say that there was need for a more regular and a unified way of observing what came to be known as rigorous asceticism and what came to be known as monasticism. By the way, Murillo is pointing out that in the Buddhist world and in other parts of the world, we have similar kinds of striving after rigor. And so that's something to bear in mind. As you look at this picture, you can see a basket being lowered down, or at least being suspended from the cliff above. And this would be a basket that was being volunteered by somebody living in the regular world who wanted to help the monk do what he was doing by providing him food, maybe washing his clothes, and having some form of human contact. Providing some sort of human contact with this person. The person who does the basket work would be called a member of a secondary or a tertiary order, and that person might be married and therefore felt he couldn't take the full monastic vow or have responsibilities in the world, or just wasn't ready to live in a cave. But he was intrigued by all of this, and he would therefore help the monk as he lived there in the cave. However, there was a real need for people to have greater accountability in this world. And so another form of monasticism emerges. And you can see that there in this next picture. You can see that this is a monastery. And it is in a fairly isolated part of the world. There's a lot of desert around. There is a modern road leading up to this monastery. It would have been an old dusty road back 1,500 years ago. But you can see to the left a lake of some sort, but there's not a lot of recreational and civilizational comforts around this monastery. This monastery is a Greek Orthodox monastery. We can see it from the blue roofs. That's a Greek blue there. And so it's probably located possibly in Egypt, possibly in Turkey, maybe even in Greece itself. It is surrounded by a wall. That wall would be used to keep enemies and people who were not part of the monastic community out. It would also be used to keep people in, especially once you made the monastic vow. You were not really supposed to leave, and if you did leave, you were made to feel very guilty that you were breaking your promise to God. And so you can see there very thick walls and huge tall walls, 15, 20 feet high. There's a tower there at the upper end that seems to be a defense tower. But this was very much a fortress, and this is a place that was isolated from the world. You can see a similar one here, where you can see the ravine down below, and again another Orthodox monastery. And it was to be a Greek Orthodox monastery because it has blue domes and blue cupolas. So there you have another example of a monastery. The monastery that emerged, starting with Saint Benedict, emerged in both the Byzantine world, spoken of in chapter 9, and the medieval Latin Roman Catholic world, spoken of in chapter 10. And they would be led, these institutions would be led by an abbot for a male monastery and an abbess for a convent that would contain nuns. And so here you can see an abbot with his white beard, and he is exhorting and counseling two younger men who are bowing deferentially to him. And the abbot had tremendous power. He didn't have absolute power because there was a monastic regula or rule or set of regulations that both the abbot and the monks were supposed to follow. But it was the abbot's responsibility to enforce those regulations and to enforce discipline upon people if they did not obey the regula or the rule. And one other aspect of this, at least in this modern picture, is you can see that the abbot was somebody that is shorter than these younger men. And this reflects, to some degree, dietary change in the 20th century. The abbot was born perhaps before World War I, certainly before World War II, and he would not have as much access to meat and to protein. The other fellas, they've had a lot more meat. They've had hamburgers and steaks and so forth, and so they are quite literally a foot taller than the abbot who is there. In the back, you can see a chapel with the blue dome. Let's go on to the next. One of the things that the monastic world wanted to remind you of was your mortality and the fact that you really sat on the shoulders of giants. It's not all about you all by yourself, but that you are one of a stream of thousands of people who are serving God. And so here you see what is called a charnel house. And the charnel house is more of a Middle Eastern and Eastern Orthodox phenomenon because in the ancient Near East and in the Middle East, many times when people passed away, they would be put into a cave and their body would be left to decay for maybe 10 or 15 years. But eventually, their bones would be retrieved, and here you have your skull placed in the charnel house to remind you that you're nothing special, that you're just simply a monk, and that you too will die. You can see the graffiti there with the crosses on the side of the charnel house. In the Western world, most monasteries would have a cemetery next door or within their precincts, again, to remind people of the fact that life is short and that they will face God soon and that they need to be ready. And so you see here an aspect of the monastic world that often people don't see. Here you can see an Italian, I think it's an Italian monastery. It has red roofs, so it is certainly on the western side. This would be a Roman Catholic monastery. And you can see that, like in the other part of the world, those other monasteries, this is a very isolated place where people are isolated from the world. And you can see here that this is a world that probably doesn't have much electricity in terms of modern conveniences, and meets your basic needs, but is detached from the rest of the madding crowd, as one author has put it later on. This monastery has at the center a tower. You can see the tower in the upper right-hand corner there. And that would be a bell tower, which would be above the chapel, which is directly beneath the bell tower. It was the job of the bell ringer to call people to prayer 7 times a day. In the Christian world, the monastic world, you prayed 7 times a day. In the Muslim world, you prayed 5 times a day in the direction of Mecca. In the Roman Catholic world, you prayed 7 times a day. Generally, you would go to bed with the sunset, so you go to bed at 8 o'clock at night, and but you would rise at 4 o'clock in the morning for morning prayers, the first set of morning prayers, which is matins, and then 2 or 3 hours later, you have lauds and or praise to God. You'd have breakfast, and you'd work in the field perhaps, or do some sort of study or Bible reading. And then at 9 o'clock you had terce, and at noon you had sex, the 6th hour, and at 3 p.m. you had nones, the ninth hour, and then towards the end of the day you would have vespers, somewhere around 5:30 in the afternoon, supper after that, and then you would have compline at the end of the day, and into bed you would go at 8 o'clock at night, because again, there is no electricity in this institution that is before you. You can see that the chapel has a long area attached to it under a red roof, and I'm fairly certain that that is the dormitory that would make it easy for people to get out of their monastic cell, go down the hall into the chapel for morning prayers in a quick and efficient manner. And so most of the monasteries had dormitories, and again, in order for you to rise in time for morning prayers, the bell would ring. And some of you may be familiar with the French song Frère Jacques. Frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous. Sonnez les matines, ding dong ding, ding dong ding. And when I was growing up, I thought Sonnez les matines was Semele Matima, so that's what I used to sing when I was a 6-year-old boy. My mother taught me that song. But Frère Jacques is Brother John, Brother John. The monks were called brothers, the nuns were called sisters. Dormez-vous, and dormez-vous is related to the word dormitory. It's French for are you sleeping? Are you in your dormitory? Sonnez les matines. Sonne is sound or sounding. La matina is the morning bells. Morning bells are ringing. Morning bells are ringing. Ding dong ding. And so Brother John had better get up. There are consequences for not getting up out of bed and missing morning prayers. And you would have to do penance. And you might be called in front of the entire monastic community and asked to give an explanation, perhaps given corporal punishment or something like that. So you made sure you got up with morning bells at 4 a.m. or thereabouts. To the left of the dormitory is an area, and you can see just the rounded arches over there. And those rounded arches are around a garden area. You can just see the garden area, and that is called a cloister. And the cloister would be an open-air porch. If it were raining, the monks would be protected from the rain. But you could, at a time of rest, enjoy the garden. Looking out on the garden, you might read the Bible or do your prayers around the cloister, especially in the summertime, spring and summer and fall, perhaps not in the winter. And so you had a cloister, and then you may have had, for instance, a library. Probably that building in the foreground is a library. You would have a kitchen, and that's probably the second long red roof parallel to the dormitory, or not a kitchen, a dining hall, and then the kitchen would be the small red roof, and that you might have an administrative building or a hospital or something in that final building that is perched at the very top to the left, just as it seems to almost fall into the ravine below. And so again, this would be a monastery that would have tertiary orders that would bring the monks food. As the years passed, the monasteries in the monastic world struggled with the whole issue of wealth. They would help people, and then as they helped people, people would, in 10, 20, 30, 50, 70 years, leave them money, and leave them fields, and leave them land. And so the great question was, what do you do with all of this wealth? The land, though, would support a monastery like this, and peasants would farm the land, and then they would give a portion of the land to the owner. And in this case, the monastery is the owner, and therefore the land produced food for them. Let's go on to the next one. Here we have some aspects of the Christian monastic movement. We've talked already about hermit or eremitic monasticism versus cenobitic or communal monasticism. And cenobitic monasticism meant that you followed a rule or a regula, and you had the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Again, poverty, you gave up your worldly possessions. There was a big discussion as to where your worldly possessions should go. Should they go to the poor? Should you dispose of them, give to your family, and give to the poor? Should you give it to the monastery itself? And and should you allow it to be shared by all of the residents of the monastic community? And the monks of the medieval period on both sides, in the Eastern Orthodox churches and in the Western Church, but especially in the Western Church, they debated the appropriateness of the monastery or monks owning property. And they would also debate, for instance, a question like, did Jesus own the cloak that was divided at the time of his crucifixion, that the soldiers cast lots for? And if he was an owner of that cloak, that meant therefore it was okay for a monk to own something. The right question would be, how much would a monk own? Jesus, you may recall, tells the rich young ruler to go and sell all that he has and give to the poor and then come and follow me. If Jesus did not own the cloak, what that would mean is that Jesus did not own property, and therefore the monks should not own property, and nor indeed should the monastery own property. And then property might be held in escrow for a monastery. So some of these questions became very complicated. Fra Angelico in the world of Italy painted beautiful paintings for the monks to enjoy in their cells. And you can go to one of the museums in Italy that is originally a monastery, and you see these beautiful fresco paintings on the walls of the monastery. And they're priceless now because they are by the great Renaissance artist Fra Angelico. So that whole question of poverty was something that bothered people. At times there would be times of monastic reform because people felt that poverty and chastity and obedience were being neglected. The great Benedictine movement following Saint Benedict of Nursia's regula or rule, after 500 years, 400 years, in the 900s, a lot of people concluded it had gone corrupt. And therefore, because of that, there were reform movements. One of the early reform movements came out of the monastery of Cluny, the Cluniac reforms, and in eastern France. And then eventually another monastery, Citeaux, felt that the Cluniac reforms had gone bad. And so the monastery of Citeaux led the Cistercian reforms. And in both cases, they sought way out of the way places far from centers of civilization in order to not be distracted by the wealth and the temptations of this world. So the Cistercian reforms were kicked in. Eventually, there were people who wanted even further reform, and the Franciscans felt that the poor were being neglected. Some monks and monastic movements became what are called mendicant orders. They felt that the monks were too isolated, that they should work amongst the people and help the people, and therefore they should beg for a living and go from town to town begging and helping those who are poor. And so that's what the Franciscans did. There were some other movements, the Dominicans, who also felt that teaching and education had been neglected. And so there's a whole series of movements in the Western Church especially, but also in the Eastern Church that seek to live up to these ideals. There's a mountain in northern Greece called Mount Athos, and on Mount Athos, women are not allowed to step foot because they would be a distraction to the monks and to the men there. And indeed, if you want to go to Mount Athos as a layperson, you have to get special permission from the Greek Orthodox Church to go up there, and they don't just let anybody in. And so it is, again, a place where people are to try to practice the vows of poverty and chastity and obedience. Chastity, you give up any hope of marriage, and you gave up relationships with the opposite sex. Um, in some cases, you might have widowers whose wives had died and the children are grown. They might be so overwhelmed with sorrow that they might become a monk themselves. But generally, the whole issue of chastity was more of a phenomenon for those who were younger, who had to make that choice: am I going to pursue marriage or am I not? And then obedience to the law of the monastery, to the regulation, the regula, and obedience to the Bible, and obedience to the abbot. Poverty, chastity, and obedience were the three major vows that a monk or a nun took. Most communal monasteries or convents had an abbot for a monastery or an abbess for a convent. The word abbot comes from the Hebrew word abba for father, and they usually also had a monastic rule to live by. Thus, we talk about the regular clergy who follow a regula or rule. And then we talk about secular clergy, who are the parish priests working amongst the population, the general population. Most monasteries had a chapel or a church, a refectory or dining hall for eating, a kitchen, a dormitory, a library, a chapter house for meeting, a cloister, a guest house, an infirmary, and a bathroom and washing area. Go on to the next slide here. Monasteries and convents were places of refuge and learning during the periods of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Late antiquity would be roughly the period 312 down to 500 AD. Roman Empire on the western side collapsed by 476. That's the last time an emperor was on the western throne. The city of Rome was trashed by barbarians in 410, and so late antiquity is generally that time from that period of time from Constantine's conversion all the way down to the collapse of the Western Empire. The Middle Ages is roughly 500 AD or CE down to the year 1517. 1517 is when Martin Luther launches the Protestant Reformation, and we really do enter a new world with the Columbian project and with Columbus and the opening up of the Atlantic to trade with the wooden boats and so forth. So that's sort of the end of the Middle Ages, is the Reformation, the beginnings of mercantilism and merchant activity all over the world, but especially in the Atlantic, and then also the emergence of the printing press that spread knowledge all over the world in a much more efficient way. Monasteries and convents were therefore places of refuge and learning for the orphan. If you had no parents or your parents had died, you might end up as a child in a convent or a monastery. The sick, the disabled, the poor, those with emotional and psychological problems, the abandoned, and abandoned could be adults who have been abandoned, perhaps even in their old age, and children who were illegitimate, war refugees, widows and widowers, and youngest or younger sons or daughters with no inheritance. Sometimes if a family had 6 or 7 children, by the time child number 7 rolls around and comes along and has come to maturity, there's no more land left, or mom and dad have passed on and they didn't get much of an inheritance because the older ones took it all. And what are you going to do? Well, especially if you're a woman, you would perhaps show up at the local convent and volunteer and say, I'd like to become part of your community. And you had a new family, essentially. Your convent took care of you if you kept your vows all the way to the end of your life. Some monasteries and convents also served as places of learning during this period of time from 312 to 1517. Some monasteries and convents served as hospitals. Most had a school. Most had a library. We do need to remember that monastic libraries and schools preserved the Bible and Greco-Roman classical learning for future generations. They also sent out missionaries to unreached peoples next door. To the north were Vikings. From the east, from the Central Asian steppe, The barbarians had swept in and conquered the western side of the Roman Empire, and now the barbarians and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, their descendants, were objects of missionary activity amongst the Western Roman Catholic Church, and so many barbarian offspring submitted themselves in the same way that the Romans had submitted themselves. They did it in mass baptisms, and the church therefore has a new agenda, and that is to teach Christian conduct, Christian doctrine, Christian belief in the Bible to a huge number of people who were calling themselves Christian and were members of the church, and yet were not members in good standing, were not well behaved, and were generally incredibly ignorant. And Vikings, of course, were trashing monasteries, and yet, interestingly enough, the descendants of the Vikings embraced Christianity and settled down by about the year 1000, certainly by the year 1100. Muslims were a new challenge for the church, and the Muslim world took over the ancient Near East, the Byzantine world, and swallowed up the Byzantine world. And nevertheless, the Byzantine world, led by the Greek Orthodox Church, sent missionaries out, as I've noted earlier, up the rivers of what is today Russia, up to Kiev, where in 988, the Rus people, who were really descendants of the Vikings, of Viking invaders, embraced Christianity, and the Greek Orthodox translated Bible and theology and so forth into the language of the Rus people and to other people of Eastern Europe, and gave them the Cyrillic alphabet, which is based on the Greek alphabet. And therefore you have a incredible amount of work, and the emergence of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Romanian Orthodox Church, and then further on, as you hit the area known as the Danube Valley in Austria, you have the Roman Catholic world and the children of the barbarians. And so the world looked very different by the year 1000 AD, and certainly by the year 1500 AD. The institution of the monastery was very influential and was a stabilizing influence in the world around the Mediterranean. To some degree, the Buddhist monastery did some of the same things in the world of China and in the world of Southeast Asia, and perhaps to some degree in the world of India. Thank you, and have a good day.